Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the ARCO Forum. It's my great pleasure to introduce Julie Boatwright Wilson, a lecturer in public policy and director of the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy. The Weiner Center is one of the preeminent research centers here at the Kennedy School and indeed in the nation, and Julie is its director, and she's going to introduce someone that many of us see in many roles, but in particularly as a citizen leader who has had a major impact in this country's policy already, and indeed is here tonight to talk about how to have even more of an impact. Julie Wilson.
Thank you, Phil. Thank you. It is with enormous pleasure and admittedly some sadness that I introduce tonight's speaker, Marian Wright Edelman, founder of the Children's Defense Fund. The pleasure derives from the fact that Marian is one of the more remarkable women who we see today. She's committed her entire career to addressing the needs of the most vulnerable and the most disenfranchised members of the American community. The sadness, though, comes because despite her efforts and the efforts of others, the need for her work still continues. And what she's here to talk to us tonight about is what we can all do to help. Marian is an advocate for children and their families in the finest sense of the word. The mission of the Children's Defense Fund is to educate everyone about the needs of children and to encourage preventive investment in children before they become one of those dire statistics that we read about far too often. Statistics about high school dropouts, about abused and neglected children, about pregnant and parenting teens, about delinquents. Unfortunately, the list can go on. Now, for Kennedy School students, one of the most important questions is, how did Marian accomplish this? How did she get where she is today? Well, hard work is clearly a big part of the answer. Marian's a graduate of Spelman College and Yale Law School. She began her career in the mid-'60s when, as the first woman admitted to the Mississippi Bar, she directed the NAACP Legal Defense and Education Fund office in Jackson, Mississippi. In 1968, she moved to Washington, D.C. as counsel for the Poor People's March that Dr. Martin Luther King was organizing before his death. Later, she founded the Washington Research Project, a public interest law firm and the parent of today's Children's Defense Fund. She started the Children's Defense Fund in 1973. Now, in addition to all of that, Marian found time to serve on a number of boards, including the board of the Malcolm Weiner Center for Social Policy, and to write a number of books: Families in Peril, An Agenda for Social Change, The Measure of Success, A Letter to My Children and Yours, and Guide My Feet, Meditations on and Prayers on Loving and Working for Children. And she and her husband have done a remarkable job raising 3 sons. Marian Wright Edelman embodies what is best in advocates. She has a deep commitment to a set of values that speak to the importance of opportunity for everyone in our multicultural society. She has a policy analyst's capacity to go straight to the jugular of the body of problems that our society faces. She has an educator's understanding of how to deliver the message in a way that each important actor in the life of a child understands. And she has a preacher's articulateness and fire in delivering the message. Finally, she has a parent's capacity to love and to nurture all children. Marian, the only reluctance I have in offering you the podium is the last time you came to speak, you enticed one of our faculty members to leave and go to the Children's Defense Fund, Olivia Golden. Despite this, you're a role model for all of us, and I'm honored to introduce Marian Wright Edelman.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you. We're still recruiting, so if there are any other faculty members who'd like a little excitement, come on down with me. Thank you very much for that generous introduction. We're living at an incredible moral moment in history. Few human beings are blessed to anticipate or experience the beginning of a new century and millennium. How will we say thanks for the life, earth, nation, and children God has entrusted to our care? What legacies, principles, values, and deeds will we stand for? and send to the future through our children to their children and to a spiritually confused, balkanized, and violent world, hungering desperately for moral leadership. How will progress be measured over the next 1,000 years if we survive them? By the kill power and number of weapons of destruction we can produce and traffic at home and abroad, or by our willingness to shrink, indeed destroy, the prison of violence constructed at home and abroad in the name of peace and security? Will we be remembered in this last part of this century by how many material things we can manufacture, advertise, sell, and consume, or by our rediscovery of more lasting non-material measures of success, a new Dow Jones for the purpose and quality of life in our families, neighborhoods, and national community? Will we be remembered by how rapidly technology and corporate mergermania can render human beings and human work obsolete, or by a better balance between corporate profits and corporate caring for children, families, and communities? Will we be remembered by how much a few at the top can get at the expense of the many at the bottom and in the middle, or by our struggle as Americans for a concept of enough for all of us? The answers lie in the values, decisions, and actions we stand for today. What an opportunity for good or evil we Americans personally and collectively hold in our hands as parents, citizens, community leaders, and as titular world leader in the post-Cold War and post-industrial era on the cusp of the third millennium. Czech Republic President Havel said recently that there are good reasons for suggesting that the modern age has ended. Many things indicate, he said, that we're going through a transitional period when it seems that something is on the way out and something else is painfully being born. It is as if something were crumbling, decaying, and exhausting itself, while something else still indistinct were arising from the rubble. 1,000 years ago, the United States was not even a dream. Copernicus and Galileo had not told us the earth was round or revolved around the sun. Gutenberg's Bible was not printed. Wycliffe hadn't translated it into English, and Martin Luther had not tacked his thesis on the church door. The Magna Carta did not exist. Chaucer's and Shakespeare's tales had not been spun, and Bach, Beethoven's, and Mozart's magical music had not been created to inspire, soothe, and heal our spirits. European serfs struggled in bondage while African empires flourished in independence. Native Americans peopled our land free of slavery's blight, and Hitler's Holocaust had yet to show the depths human evil can reach when good men and women remain silent or indifferent. 1,000 years from now, will civilizations remain and humankind survive? Will America's dream be alive, be remembered, and be worth remembering? Will the United States be a blip or a beacon in history? Can our founding principle that all men and women and children are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights withstand the test of time, the tempest of politics, and become deed and not just creed for every child? Is America's dream big enough? For every fifth child who is poor, every sixth child who is black, every seventh child who is Latino, every eighth child who is mentally or physically challenged? Can our children, each of whom the Indian philosopher Tagore said comes with the message that God is not yet discouraged of man, become the healing agents of our national and world transformation and future spiritual and economic salvation? In the Jewish Midrash, it is told about God bargaining with the people of Israel about whether he would give them the Torah. But before he would agree to do so, he demanded adequate guarantors, and the people of Israel offered God their elders, and he said, no, that was not sufficient. They then offered him their prophets, and God said, no, that wouldn't do either. And it was only when God was offered their children with the promise that his word would be taught to them that he agreed to give them the Torah. When Jesus Christ invited little children to come unto him, he did not invite only rich, middle class, white, male, children without disabilities from two-parent families or our own children to come. He welcomed all children. And so must our nation, which professes to honor these Judeo-Christian traditions, and our American covenant, which talks about the sanctity of every child and human being. So what does it mean to stand for children? A young mother walked into a WIC office, which is a Women's, Infants, and Children's Nutritional Program office recently, seeking help to feed her hungry baby. When an overworked and tired WIC worker saw the baby drinking from a bottle of red liquid, she was ready to reprimand the mother. Didn't she know that babies needed milk and not Kool-Aid? Just as she was about to scold, the young mother broke down into tears. She had run out of money a week ago, hadn't eaten in 3 days, knew her baby needed to eat, and had gone and spent her last money on baby formula, which had run out the day before. She'd then gone to McDonald's in desperation and filled the baby's bottle with the 2 free things she could find, ketchup and water. Now, I think we need to ask ourselves and ask our political leaders whether they think this hungry baby, and whether we think this hungry baby is responsible for America's ills, for our budget deficit, crime problem, and poor education system. Is this baby responsible for the structural changes, wage stagnation in our labor market, deindustrialization of our cities, and economic blight in many rural areas? Did this baby and desperate mother have any control over the downsizing of giant corporations, the replacement of human workers by technology, or the exportation of jobs abroad in our global economy? Is this baby, who had a 1 in 3 chance of being born without timely prenatal care and the world's leader on health technology, and a 1 in 4 chance of being born poor in the richest nation on earth, the cause or the victim of the widening income gap between rich and poor, which allow 23,000 poor families with children to live on less income in 1993 than one entertainment industry executive? This baby did not manufacture or sell the 211 million guns circulating in our nation today that kill an American child like her every hour and a half. And she did not contribute to the pervasive breakdown of moral, family, and community values in our too selfish and too secular culture. And this baby is not responsible for her mother's or father's poverty or behavior or ours. This baby did not vote for Democrats, Republicans, Independents, liberals, or conservatives, cannot make campaign contributions, lobby, or hold press conferences to make her needs known. That's why you and I have to make those needs known, and that's why we're doing Stand for Children on June 1st. This baby, like my child and yours, is a sacred gift of the ones you're going to have, is a sacred gift of a loving God and a citizen of the wealthiest nation in the history of the planet. Denying her food, preventive health care, the chance to get ready for and learn in schools that expect her to learn and support her in learning, and access to safe child care if her parents work outside the home, and safety from the violent war that is raging in our neighborhoods is immoral and lacks both common sense and budget sense. Blaming and punishing this baby for our personal or collective discontents, for the shortcomings and unfairness of our economy, or for short-term political or economic gain by anybody, contravenes the Old and New Testament and American covenants that we honor so well in our words, but too often so poorly in our deeds. After 20-plus years of advocacy, trying every traditional advocacy method, and we will continue to do that, it is time to do something more, but this has been the most dangerous year and remains a dangerous time for children and for families, and it's been very hard to get the American people to understand what is involved here, because we've been out-sloganed and out-technologized and out-organized, and it's really important, with all of us having been glued to OJ and with our media not dealing with complexity, that we still try to say what is going on here. And it's very important in a democracy that people do struggle to know what is going on in their name. And I'm so tired of people acting as if the government, whether it's the city government or the state government or the federal government, is something over here that belongs to somebody else. In a democracy, these are our governments, and we are responsible for the actions that are taken in our name. And so let me try to explain what I view as happening in Washington and then see if we can't begin to educate ourselves, and hopefully over the next weeks and months, when the very fundamental values of this nation are going to be either redefined or affirmed, and I hope we will be involved in whatever that decision is going to be, that we will have done it with our eyes open and with our voices heard. But imagine two houses. One is a relatively small house at the seat of our national government. President Roosevelt began constructing it over 6 decades ago to make sure that America's children, poor, and other vulnerable Americans would be guaranteed a floor of decency, regardless of the state or family they chanced to be born in. Its 4 basic rooms include a family support room with aid to families with dependent children, or AFDC, which is what we normally think of as welfare, and that's the program we all love to hate. Child care is the second thing in this room to help mothers get off and stay off welfare. Supplemental Security Income, or SSI, for families with disabled children is the third occupant of this family support room, and the Earned Income Tax Credit, or the EITC, to help poor working families get out of poverty and to make work pay, round out this room of so-called means-tested entitlements of family support. The majority of the families, contrary to the slogans residing in this room, have children, are white, and have a parent in the labor market. While the family supports in this room never were designed to lift all of its residents out of poverty or to close the gaps in the economy for all those left behind, over the decades they have kept the wolves of hunger and homelessness away from the doors of millions of poor families and helped many mothers and children escape domestic violence. The second room in this smaller house that President Roosevelt began constructing is for child and family nutrition, more than 25 million of whose occupants are children. School lunches, child care, and Head Start feeding programs, food stamps, and summer feeding programs reside here. Construction of this room began in 1948 with school lunches. This room was expanded significantly during the Nixon years, virtually eradicating child and family hunger in America in the 1970s. And we must remember this hunger was the first issue that the Children's Defense Fund worked on, and Robert Kennedy came down to Mississippi, went out through the empty shacks, came back, and after hearings from the McGovern Committee and lots of things, President Nixon responded to the need to see that this country did not have hungry families and expanded the food program significantly. So when you hear people say that these are intractable problems, just remember, these are not acts of God. These are political choices of men and women, and that they can be changed. And how sad to see hunger come back in the 80s and to come back in the 90s and have our leaders debate today how much more they're going to cut from family and child nutrition rather than how we strengthen this in an economy where many working parents and other poor people are struggling to make ends meet. The third room is for health care, primarily Medicaid, on which 20 million poor children depend for immunizations, prenatal and primary health care. 1 in 3 births, almost 1 in 3 preschoolers, and 1 in 2 black children depend on Medicaid health coverage. Here also reside the poor elderly and disabled persons and others who need long-term and nursing home care. The majority of Medicaid children have a parent who works outside the home and are white. The fourth room is for children at risk of neglect and abuse whose families are at risk of breaking down or already have broken down and require the help of our overburdened child welfare system. About 3 million children need a safe haven in this room. Now, the rooms in this house for vulnerable children and families cannot accommodate all in need of help. We all know that there are still nearly 15 million poor children, 1 in 5. 1 in 8 of our children lacks health coverage, and I think it's obscene, frankly, that we're debating in Washington today not how we can get health care for every one of the 10 million children who don't have it, but we're debating how we can ward off a block grant that will take away 3 million Medicaid cards from 13 to 18-year-olds. And as we read the erosion of private health insurance combined with the block grants and proposed cuts, we would move in the name of health reform from 10 million children without health care to roughly 19 million by the year 2002. I don't think that that is progress. Some of the rooms in this house need renovation, and we're not here to defend the status quo. I'm not for any status quo that leaves 15 million children poor and 10 million without health care. And we do need true welfare reform and attention to jobs and wages and to health care. But some do need expansions because the people that live in this house don't have a lot of money or power or ability to lobby for their needs. And since the majority of the residents are voteless children, they are particularly unable to make their needs known. Now imagine a second house, another much bigger house at the seat of our national government alongside the smaller house. Here live Americans who are not poor or disabled. Its occupants can hire lots of people to keep their house in good shape and even add to it. This house has bigger rooms that cost taxpayers a lot more. Its furnishings include $600 billion of non-means tested entitlements indexed for cost of living for 48 million Americans, most with income above poverty. About $81 billion a year goes to 6 million Americans with incomes of $50,000 or more. It houses welfare subsidies and tax breaks for big corporations, rich farmers, sugar growers, ranchers, and wealthy individuals, which total over $100 billion a year. The Pentagon and its contractors live here, too. Congress recently gave them, and the President signed, a $6.9 billion bonus they did not even request. Most of the occupants in this house have not been asked to contribute much toward balancing the budget, although they cost taxpayers 3 times more than the occupants in the smaller house. In fact, 50% of this house in the budget resolutions last year were exempted from budget cuts. Now imagine our political leaders saying that they want to balance the budget. What is the first step that they took? They voted a $220 billion plus tax cut for many of the people in the big house, and they paid for it by cutting about $229 billion from the children and families in the little house. President Clinton proposed to give a tax cut of only $87 billion, although he, like Congress, understands that someone has to pay for it, someone without much money or power. I just ask you whether you think a big tax cut or any tax cut for non-needy citizens makes sense, while claiming you cannot pay your bills or afford to educate and feed your children. Is it the American way to cut school lunches and child care and education to make powerful friends happy or yourselves politically popular, even in an election year? Is it credible for any of our congressional leaders to argue that they are protecting children from a future debt that children did not create by destroying the vital laws and investments they need to live, learn, and grow today? For me, this is the domestic equivalent of bombing Vietnamese villages in order to save them. Now, all of the unjust budget cuts directed at poor children and families in 1995 were 6 to 7 times worse than the Reagan-era cuts. And I'm not talking about cuts in the discretionary programs. I've just, in describing these houses, been talking about those that are guarantees as a part of our safety net. They are not the most serious battle that our children and families face in the multi-front budget war on the young, the poor, and average working Americans. The massive cuts are like stealing the furniture from our children's rooms and knocking big holes in their walls and roofs. You know, when infant mortality begins to go back up, or more low birth weight babies because of the erosion in health insurance occurs, or when hunger and homelessness begins to hit even harder here in Massachusetts and in Boston, because you can't take hundreds of billions of dollars away and not put something better in place until there's not going to be suffering. We will wake up and we'll say, my goodness, we didn't really mean to cause that kind of suffering. And so you can always put the money back. You can put the furniture back in the house, and you can patch the hole in the roof, and you can fill in the hole that was knocked in the walls. But the block grants are something else. The block grants, through these block grants, congressional leaders seek to permanently bulldoze our children's house, to remove it from the seat of our national government and consciousness, and disperse responsibility for American children out to 50 states with hundreds of billions fewer dollars and no safeguards for children. Now, we're in the middle of a new week where it has not yet been translated into legislative language, and we at least seem for the moment to not be talking a whole lot about balanced budget. I've been out of Washington for all of 12 hours, so I'm probably obsolete and irrelevant. But at least what we know is that when I left yesterday, they were talking about welfare reform with about $48 billion in cuts, but again, only those that would affect the poor without any demand on the people in the big house. Even that has been dropped from some previous negotiations, however unfair. Now, pending block grants have been wrapped in attractive slogans like welfare reform, state flexibility, getting government closer to the people, decreasing bureaucracy, weeding out waste, and decreasing teen and out-of-wedlock births, all goals I deeply share. But when you unwrap the box and examine its contents, as citizens in a democracy must do, and obviously as students at the Kennedy School must do, you will find a cruel gift to children struggling to beat the odds of poverty, sickness, family breakdown, and violence in our society. Now, President Clinton and some congressional Democrats last year said they wanted to find, and still are saying they want to find, a political middle ground, where the children would be hurt a lot, but not as much as they would be under the Republican welfare reform plan. While the Gingrich-Dole budget plan would have dismantled all 4 cornerstones last year of the National House for Poor and Disabled Children and Families, many Democrats wanted to eliminate only one, primarily income assistance or welfare in the traditional sense, and maybe weaken a few others. But if you take away one of the cornerstones of a house, the whole house becomes destabilized and vulnerable. And if the moral principle of a child's basic guarantee to survival income is negotiated away, why should not that guarantee to health and nutrition and child welfare and child care and safety be negotiated away now or later? And in fact, that's exactly what is going on now in Washington with the NGA proposals, which is in process of being translated into legislative language, all the cornerstones of the House. And they may leave school lunch, okay, because that's a politically popular program, are being negotiated about now. If block grants are so good for poor children, I wonder why they aren't equally good for non-needy corporate welfare recipients. Is there such a thing as half justice or just a touch of morality? A tiny bit of right and wrong? Is it all right to cut off only one of your child's legs or to starve her rather than let her suffer, perish from preventable disease? Are these really our only or our best choices? I hope we can debate this, because for me, these block grants would take us back many decades and say to our children and families that you have no right to protection from your national government during times of need, recession, or natural disaster. If your state runs out of money and you're an abused child or mother, tough luck. If you lose your job and need temporary help, too bad. Block grants, these, as they are written, say it is not important whether an American child in one state has the same chance for health, safety, food, and survival as an American child in another state. Block grants say that we have 2 tiers of citizenship in America. The children and the poor are not entitled to a guaranteed national floor of assistance, but well-off citizens, powerful corporations, and Pentagon contractors are. These block grants exacerbate or will exacerbate, if they are not resisted, America's indefensible gap between non-voting children and voting adults. And let me just say, I'm not hopeless. It is a miracle that we're standing here still debating this. If you'd asked us this time last year, when it seemed that everything was inevitable, that we'd still be alive, even though we face enormous new dangers over the next weeks and months, I would have said that's not possible, though we all kept working, and people picked up the phone, and they did mobilize, and they did try to educate. And if you told us that we would have been able to turn back the balanced budget amendment, even by 1 vote in the Senate, we would have said that was a miracle, but that did happen. And the point is, in a democracy, people, when they become informed, can also become mobilized. And so we encourage you to become mobilized. Do you believe, like our governors and our Congress seem to believe, that if you're a 13-year-old American who needs health care, that you deserve no guaranteed coverage, but if you're in the Senate or House or White House or State House or 66 or 76 or 86 that you do? Do you think that if you're one of God's 2-month-olds in Mississippi, which just ratified the 13th Amendment's prohibition against slavery in 1995 and reinstituted compulsory school attendance to age 16 in 1993 after repealing it to avoid Brown versus Board of Education, that you deserve income assistance of $40, but if you're aged, blind, or disabled, you're guaranteed a minimum of $460. What kind of family values does a nation truly have that is more willing to spend $20,000 plus a year to imprison a youth and is unwilling to invest $1,000 plus in giving that child a healthy start with good prenatal care? 1/3 of our babies are born without prenatal care. No other industrialized nation permits this. And is not willing to give a child $3,500 to give him a head start, so that we hope that prison may not be necessary later on. These are the questions I hope we will debate this year, because I have never seen the values more clearly drawn as they are, and the choices more clearly drawn, and we may be on all sides of this. And this is not to say that we do not need reform. We do need welfare reform, but we need welfare reform that does indeed protect children and puts parents to work. It is not welfare reform, in my view, that makes 1.5 million more children poor and pushes many more families deeper into poverty, that takes away health and safety standards from child care that we've struggled 20 years to get. At the same time as we talk about having goals 2000, getting all of our children ready for school, we should be strengthening the quality of child care, not weakening it. We don't need to warehouse more of our children. It is not health reform that's going to leave more children sick and at risk of no health coverage rather than the other way around. And so we've got to change the terms of the debate and really talk about the choices that are before us and talk about fair sacrifice among all elements and what does it demand, what are the demands on us as Americans and as some Americans who profess to be Americans of faith to do what is needed for our children. So we are trying to call that question on June 1st at the Lincoln Memorial. We have to have a movement. We can't get here from there under any terms of the budget resolutions by anybody in the 7-year attempts to balance the budget and with so much of the budget off the table and we will never be able to get our children a healthy start and a safe start and a fair start in life unless we build a powerful moral movement to leave no child behind. So that's why we have called Stand for Children Day on June 1st at the Lincoln Memorial. We have never done a mass mobilization for anything and don't know what we're doing other than we're going to come up and we're going to stand up and say, all you folk, parents and grandparents and religious leaders and community leaders and young people and educators and youth themselves, let's come and stand together and stand tall for our children, and let's say that across race and class and faith and region, we may not be able to agree on a lot of things, but we're going to agree on an ethos of doing no harm to children. And in this last national election year, we even want to hold ourselves to a higher standard of doing what children need to grow up healthy and educated in this country. We want to draw a moral line in the political sand that none of our political leaders of any party will ever feel free to cross again, that we want to see that our children can get the support they need and that parents need to be helped and not hindered in raising their children. We want to have our children see adults come and stand up for them. One of the things that was so important to me in my childhood, when the good old days were not so good, but we had a seamless web of support between church and school and parents, and they were always out there, despite the external world, struggling to make life better for us. And it was because we had that adult example of caring and struggle that made us always think that we could make a difference. And they didn't tell us we were always going to win, and oftentimes we lost, but they always said we're going to fight to make sure that you have a better life. And we mustn't forget that miracle of small bands of brave parents who wanted their children to have a better education, going to small bands of underfunded public interest lawyers, the Legal Defense Fund, the Thurgood Marshalls, the Charlie Houstons, who brought down legal apartheid. It was because people cared enough to take risk and to fight for their children. And it's time to have that again, so I hope you will come. I hope you will come with children and grandchildren and younger siblings and brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles and as religious leaders who support children to say to our children that we are here and that as citizens in a democracy that we can fight and we will stand up and we will at least speak for and with you. I also want all the wonderful people that are doing wonderful things for children all over this country. There's like two Americans that war with each other, and there's a tug for who's going to win, and I know who's got to win and who's going to win. But I don't know that I've ever seen a time when there are more wonderful people doing wonderful things in isolation in communities. And so we want them all to come together and see all the other extraordinary people in such large numbers who are doing things and let them understand that they're part of a broader movement that together is going to add up to a powerful momentum over the next decade to change the paradigm of what we care about in this nation. I also think it's so important that we, in the face of all the voices of division, come together in an inclusive witness and day of commitment for something that brings us together as Americans, and I think that the Lincoln Memorial is the place to do that. Finally, I hope we'll be inspired to go back home and take action, because this is really about trying to affirm that children really are terribly important, and we're going to put them first as parents and as leaders. And we're going to go back home, I hope, inspired by the fact there are a lot of other people out there who are trying and struggling to do that, but we're going to go back home with citizen guides and parents' guides and things we can do as one person of faith or as one congregation, and with checklists of what our government can do to make it easier rather than harder. And we're going to develop a set of Sullivan principles of what corporations can do to make sure that they're doing things that help parents rather than hurt parents and who are struggling to balance work and family needs and to raise healthy children. And all through this year back home, we want to make sure that people are standing for children, that everywhere anybody goes, particularly our political leaders, that they see us. And we will have civic education schools going on using case studies, some of which are here from Massachusetts, of parents and community leaders and religious leaders who come together to make a difference so that people can get a sense that they can make a difference. That in a democracy, we really have to struggle to make a difference. And so Stand for Children Day is not a one-day stand. It is a beginning, a catalytic, I hope, inspiration to people to come back home, and we will have leadership training and materials and people and forums that we will hope will encourage action all year round. I've been very moved by the response to this because we are terrified. I wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning with nightmares. I'm out at Lincoln Memorial by myself. So I hope you all will not let that happen. We decided to do this over the Christmas holidays, and because we're either going to sink or swim, and we've got to learn how to swim. Because our children really require us to learn how to swim and swim well and effectively despite the waves that go on in the ocean that threaten them so. But by February 1st, we had an office up, and I was so pleased that the headquarters, this has been a separately incorporated thing, was contributed by a child care group, and we have wonderful young organizers, and by the time we announced it, we had 300 co-sponsors. I had hoped for 50, and today I'm pleased to announce that we have 1,200 organizational co-sponsors. It's a wonderful broad-based group from the Girl Scouts to the YWCAs to the YMCAs to the Easter Seals to the virtually all of the religious community across space, to the civil rights community, to the women's community, the entire senior citizens community, to the youth serving community, and I do hope this will be a major intergenerational day of coming together to say this is who we are as Americans. So if you are struggling to raise a child but think you can do better, come stand with us. If you are a young or a middle-income family, or want to be a young and middle-income family who is going to work hard to make ends meet despite declining wages and the economic insecurity in our economy, I hope you will come and stand with us. If you're troubled by the pollution of our airwaves, air, food, water, earth, and of our children's values, come stand with us. If you're worrying about whether the children's schools are preparing them for the 21st century and whether there's going to be a job out there if they do, come stand with us. And if you're anxious that children, your own or someone else's, will get sick and not get decent medical care because there is no health insurance, come stand. If you lie awake at nights, as many parents do, concerned about all these guns in circulation and about the random violence that is so pervasive that threatens every one of us, then come stand with us. If you've had enough, as I have, of political leaders from all parties using children as political props and pawns and talking about family values while not supporting what families need to raise healthy, moral, and educated children, come stand with us. And if you believe in just basic values of fairness and fair sacrifice as Americans, then you come and stand with us and affirm that value on the eve of a new millennium. I want to end with a prayer, as I do these days, because I think that much of what we're struggling with really comes from a spiritual poverty that we need to confront. And while we must take count of our personal morality, we need to also deal with our social morality. And so I hope that we can have a profound debate about what it means to be an American at all levels. But let me end with a prayer to ask God to forgive our rich nation, where small babies die of cold quite legally. God, forgive our rich nation where small children suffer from hunger quite legally. Oh God, forgive our rich nation where toddlers and school children die from guns sold quite legally. Oh God, forgive our rich nation that lets children be the poorest group of citizens quite legally. Oh God, forgive our rich nation that lets the rich continue to get more at the expense of the poor quite legally. Oh God, forgive our rich nation which thinks security rests in missiles rather than in mothers and in bombs rather than in babies. Oh God, forgive our rich nation for not giving you sufficient thanks by giving to others their daily bread. Oh God, help us on the eve of this new century and millennium never to confuse what is quite legal with what is just and right in your sight. If you want our country to stand for what is just and right on the eve of this new change, and to really send a message to this world, I hope you will come and stand with children so that our country can begin to do what is just and right for the least among ourselves. So come. Thank you.
We have two microphones, one over here and one over here. We will alternate. As you ask questions, we ask you to tell us who you are and to ask a question and not make a statement. We have not too much time, and we'd like to have as many people as possible have an opportunity to ask Marian a question. Start over here.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. My name is Avery Gardner, and I'm a junior at Harvard College. I also chair the Institute of Politics Student Advisory Committee, and we're very pleased to have you here tonight.
Thank you.
I wanted to talk to you about the political realities of welfare reform, which, as you have talked about, have been quite frightening to many of us. And I'm wondering why we don't focus more of the debate on an issue that's a little less politically difficult these days, and that is the issue of fatherlessness and the issue of deadbeat dads and fathers who don't support their children, who don't pay their child support enforcement. How we can address that as a nation. We've tried to do it in the States, and we're not doing a good job. The vast majority of children do not receive child support. A huge number of mothers do not even have child support orders in place. And I'm wondering how you think we as a nation and as a Congress and as a political entity can work against that problem, which might be an easier one to confront these days than block grants.
Well, that is the one thing that I do agree on, which is in most of the welfare reform bills, and we work very hard that in every welfare reform bill there's strong child support enforcement. It is an issue that we pay a lot of attention to, have done a recent report on showing how poor job many of our states do on child support enforcement. That should be an integral part of anything that we do, and it should be strengthened anyway, with or without welfare reform. It alone, however, is not sufficient to raise people out of poverty, but it is an important component. Nobody should have children that they are not prepared to support for a lifetime, financially and emotionally. And so child support enforcement is a crucial issue that you have raised. The provisions in the welfare reform bills, both in the administration, the Matsui, and even those, have significantly strengthened child support enforcement requirements, and that should be an absolutely integral component. Whether or not one should spin it off as a separate thing is a different issue, but I agree with you that it is one that we should address and have addressed in the past with some significant strengthening of enforcement, but it ought to be a national enforcement system. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Yes, Anthony Hightower. I'm a student here at the community school. And coming from a slightly different slant here, you alluded to this issue of criminal punishment of our youth. States are increasingly imposing and making it much easier to treat our youth as adults for a variety of forms of sentencing, and also just for purposes of just assessing punishments and crimes, what have you. Is there ever a case to, in fact, treat that youth as an adult? And if so, under what type of circumstances do you think so that should be the case?
Well, you know, I am concerned about the increasing criminalization of our economy, if you will, and the adultization of our youth thing. There are some young people, you know, who are, you know, very difficult, and who at the discretion of judges, you know, may well require, you know, secure detention and maybe even waiver over into the adult system. But I think that that's, you know, but the debate that's going on now, in effect, would remove a lot of the discretion from judges, and we're going down to younger and younger ages. And while there are a number of studies to look at the effectiveness of waivers over the past, this is a trend that's been going on for a long time. We're just getting younger and younger, and it's becoming more automatic, and in the context of federal crimes as well. It needs to be looked at, and one of the horrible things that went on in the debate of the crime bill is just this attempt to move and make blanket kinds of decisions and to undermine a lot of discretion, but it's going on also in the context of denying young people, positive alternatives. You're cutting youth jobs. You're cutting alternatives to incarceration. You're cutting other prevention methods. And it seems as if we're trying to simply throw the book without sort of looking at what the consequences will be. We're already the world's largest incarcerator. How many prisons can we build? How many people can we lock up? And what an unproductive way to invest, particularly when you contrast it with all the increase in provisions for prisons, and we're cutting out after-school programs for young people who want to get positive alternatives to the streets. So in the context here, I think we have to be careful. That is not to say that there should not be a continuum. The public must be protected against violent criminals, but that is not what is happening too often with the arrest of young people who are developing records of arrests, and it is going to be the central issue we address in our new State of the Black Child report this month. But we've got to look at the whole context, and again, focus is much or more on prevention as well as on the punishment of those truly small. It's a very small percentage of criminals or young people who are the serious threat to public. We should not make policy for the 100% based on the 5%. I think we can do things in a more refined fashion. Yes.
Okay. In my case, I know you have a good friend by the name of Jonathan Kozo, who wrote
I do.
Yep, who I believe lived in this area and also wrote 2 books which certainly had a very profound impact on my life and hopefully many other people. Savage Inequalities and his more recent book, Amazing Grace. I think they should be required reading for politicians and policymakers and educators around this entire country. And I was wondering that, assuming there are those who have read it, why you feel that the debate hasn't been taken to a higher level yet in Congress and on the national media, and what should be done to make the work of your organization and Mr. Kozo's work become more well-known in public, and whether not that is related perhaps to a deep-rooted fear within the media and within the establishment of what I call maybe the brown zone, the browning of America, and the fear of perhaps what the people in the inner cities are really thinking, and maybe how we can forward that discussion here and elsewhere.
Well, I used to think when I first started, the first report we did was Title I of ESEA, which we took, Is It Helping Poor Children? And we had examined all the audit files from the Department of Health and Education and Welfare, because we came into business to try to make government efficient and make sure that the money was spent on who it was supposed to be spent on. And I thought if you just told the truth that people would do the right thing. We had a front page story in the Washington Post, and then everybody went back to doing business as usual. And so for 20 years we have been learning with report after report after report that telling the truth is simply not enough. That it takes a long time to make people hear, and change is something that is just resisted for lots of reasons. But we've got to keep doing it better. Secondly, there is a lot about who says what, and we still tend to devalue women. If I were a powerful white male saying some of these things, I mean, people act as if Dan Quayle and Bennett, concerned about teenage pregnancy, out-of-wedlock births. We've been saying this for 20 years, but nevertheless, we hope the voices must keep doing that. Thirdly, we have been out sloganing out, we've got to learn how to use the media more effectively. And we tend, all of us, and we're struggling with this at the Children's Defense Fund, we tend to talk in policy wonk terms, and nobody understands what we're talking about. We talk in too complex terms, and so we've been struggling to learn how to communicate in human terms that ordinary folk can do. And so now the standard is, can your mother in Kalamazoo understand why she must do something on whatever you're saying, and not talk in terms of programs and policy? 4, we just have to get out there a lot. I mean, it just takes a long time, and I know Jonathan is very eloquent. You ought to make it required reading. Amazing Grace is absolutely wonderful. But, there are just so many speeches that you can make, and somehow we're going to have to get a lot of spokespeople who are aware and who are going to take up this mantle and become the voices for children. But that's not going to be enough either. That's why we've got to have a movement, that people translate that new awareness and new outrage into votes and into things that people concerned about. And so that's a part of why we're doing June 1st, that, for all the Jonathan, there are a lot of really eloquent, wonderful people who have been talking and begging and pleading for years. Unless we come together in a powerful constituency that can say there's a consequence for hurting children, it will not happen. And that's very sad, because you would like to think that people would want to do good.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Eamon Rappaport. I'm a student here at the Kennedy School. First of all, thanks for your profound words. I've heard you speak several times. You're always an inspiration.
Thank you.
I'm here actually to ask for some advice for myself and for my colleagues here who care about the issues you're talking about. You might couch it as career advice, but there's this dichotomy between those of us who are training to become wonks and those who are training to become social advocates. And I've done a little bit of both. and always wondering where one can have the greatest impact. The problem I find with the political side is there's always the backstabbing and the compromise inherent in it, and yet at the grassroots level, the change may go slower. You have less of a broad impact, but it's gratifying in the end. So anyhow, for those of us contemplating which route to go, what would you suggest?
Oh, it's really not either or. You need very strong and good people inside as public servants, however frustrating the bureaucratic battle is and however, demoralizing it may well be from time to time. And so you need people in government and at all levels who are going to try to make government work, because government is our way of transmitting our values to the rest of us. And so I would encourage that. But at the same time, we clearly need strong, effective, skilled outside advocates. And outside advocacy in the 1990s really requires a level of skills and understanding of complexity and the need to meld together strategies in a way that it did not require earlier in the 60s when the issues were clearly and were not so profoundly economic and not, and with the media culture where you can't get it done in 10 seconds. And it really does require understanding the relationship between programs and policy and community empowerment strategy and politics and coalition building and now the new technology. And so, it's a very challenging, but I have always felt that I would make more of a difference on the outside, and we need clear outside advocates, but you need both. Unless there were good servants inside who were responsive and were willing to carry out and were honest, it wouldn't work. So I think you should look temperamentally at what you think you are best suited. I wouldn't last in government in a day. And so I'm just constitutionally incapable of working on the inside. But somebody's got to do that. Somebody's got to do that, and somebody's got to do it well, and you have sent some wonderful public servants from this school down there, and we're deeply grateful to have had them. But we also need to help those public servants by building that strong outside constituency. And lastly, it is so important that we go into nonprofit groups and nonprofit management, because no policy is any better than the people who are implementing it and who are committed to implementing it and seeing that it is responsive to the needs of people out in communities. And so I can't encourage too much. We at CDF have put our number one priority over the next years as in local leadership and leadership development, but trying to develop a cadre of servant leaders who are committed to empowering the community, who do not see their choices as careers, but as things that are going to serve the community and try to rebuild our families and our children. So we're looking for servant leaders, but we're training them and are trying to we have trained over 900 black college students who are out running freedom schools for 2,500 kids every summer, but these are becoming sophisticated young advocates. And there's always that tension where you got to provide them the skills to do good with the children, but you also got to give them the political sense of advocating for the children whose need for services they can never meet without changing the way in which our society invests in children. So just choose along the spectrum, but in whatever you choose, and I hope that those of you who choose to go in the private sector, that you will be good voices within that private sector to say, are our policies helping or hurting? Are we producing products or supporting ads that we would want our own children and grandchildren to see? So it doesn't matter where you are. It is your mindset, your commitments, and whether you're going to make sure that the covenants that this country stands for are on it. So it's hard, but up to you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Yes, my name is Ron Taylor. I'm a kindergarten teacher here in Boston.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And, Newsweek recently did an article, a cover story, matter of fact, on Ritalin, and I want to know your stance on that and your organization's stance on the medicating of our kids today.
We're an over-medicated society today, and so that's reflected. It's a concern. When I worked here at the Harvard Center on Law and Education, Ritalin was a concern, and that we were using that as a substitute for good stimulating child development programs and for things to keep kids busy. It is a deep concern, and we've all got to be very, very mindful of not using drugs or judging behavior that may well. When we did our first study on children out of school in America, we found this catch-all term called disruptive, which really sort of was something that was there for any child we didn't know what to do with. And one of the frequent responses, again, was for many children to be referred for Ritalin because they were hyperactive. We just need to be careful, and parents need to be very mindful about the dangers. We want children to be quiet, and we want them to be controlled. We need to sort of somehow begin to look and say, who are these children? What are they like at different stages of development, and how can we make sure that our programming and the people who are working with children are child-centered and are responsive to what is developmentally appropriate for these children, and to use drugs of any kind only as the last resort. And so it is a big concern. We're finding that with our freedom schools, that many children came back. Many of our young people came back saying, my goodness, I wasn't aware of how frequent the use of Ritalin is. So it's a concern that we must all sort of raise and debate and raise flags about.
I mean, the fact that it's not a medical problem is considered more of a sociological and psychological problem, and that attention deficit disorder is so liberal in the way that you can just say, well, he has it, and he has it, and she has it. Are you trying to work on a way that we can just have a universal description of what that is and when it's
We are
necessary?
not addressing that particular issue at this moment, no. But we do have, you've got Bob Peterkin here at the Ed School, and we've been working with Dr. Edelman Gordon, who chairs our education task force for the Black Community Crusade for Children, and this is a part of the agenda that they could take up. But CDF is not right now addressing that.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Marion Wright Edelman, it's indeed a privilege to be here and to listen to your lecture and to your answer to the questions. I want to say thank you. I think I'm very fortunate. I think all of us are very fortunate to have you as a role model.
Thank you.
I'm extremely grateful. I have a question. In terms of June 1st, will you have a concrete plan that you will offer in substitute for what's being bandied about in the legislature?
Not on June 1st. Well, CDF will have one for you on June 2nd.
Okay.
June 1st is
June
really
2nd.
a coming together of 1,200, every day we get 25 more, but of a huge number of people with a whole lot of different perspectives. And there is constantly a debate now already in the meetings with our advisory group as to whether we're going to have no agenda or a litmus list of agendas. And so we'll work through that process, but it is my sense that we will certainly not have a legislative agenda. We're not, as I said, this is not a partisan or political day. This is a day of commitment. But certainly there will be action agendas. A lot of groups who are participating in the stand are changing their lobby days. Bread for the World has a wonderful childhood hunger campaign, and they're coming to lobby over this weekend. The Great Panthers are coming to do lobbying. The National Council of Jewish Women, many of them are, each of which their agendas, and we will share those. We will clearly have and do in our annual State of the Child report and in the action guides and other things, we'll have a variety of things that we would send back. We certainly have ideas about how we would spend that $229 billion that our leaders said that they could afford in a tax cut that will buy an awful lot of children out of poverty and out of health care. And we are debating how one can perhaps begin to encourage petitions on things like health care for every child now. There are 1,000 ways in which we can, without getting into specific legislative things, because there are many ways in which we can get health care for every child right now. What we've got to do is to create the demand and say, just do it, and then find a way to do it. If you want to do it by tax cuts, do it that way. If you want to do it by this, do it that way. But just do it. And so the point of June 1st is to show that there is a massive constituency out here that wants fair treatment and investment in our children. But there will be an action agenda for people to go back home to do. And whether or not the consensus that arises from all of these different groups who are all along the political spectrum of whether they want to ask for anything, I know it will not, in a specific programmatic way on that day, I think is an open question. But my sense is that this day is a day of coming together, and that when we go back with agendas.
I'm extremely grateful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes, my name is Gail Price. I'm on the Harvard Advisory Council for Children's Health and a graduate of the School of Public Health here. The question that I have is, as part of welfare reform in Massachusetts, you may know that a law was recently passed to require AFDC recipients who have school-aged children to do community service for not-for-profit agencies. And this was very controversial in Massachusetts and continues to be controversial. At best, it was considered as a way to prepare welfare recipients for paid work. However, it was controversial because some people thought that it was a sort of an unfair imposition on the AFDC recipients. The Human Services Coalition called for noncompliance, and a number of the not-for-profit agencies were not sure as to whether they should actually allow the AFDC recipients to work in their agencies as volunteers. So I wanted to know whether you had an opinion about this sort of program and whether you thought it had an impact on the well-being of children.
Well, I don't have an opinion on this particular one because I haven't read it, and I've learned over the years never to give an opinion on anything you haven't looked at in a careful way. Obviously believe in work, I obviously believe in service, but again, I don't feel, I don't believe in punitive kind of requirements, but I would really have to look at the Massachusetts revisions, and I have not. So I'll be glad to call you up and let you know what I do think. Yes?
Hi, my name is Natasha Love, and I'm a Harvard Law student. I was wondering what you thought about the millions. You said like 3 million children need a safe harbor right now, and there are many children who are up for adoption for most of their lives or all of their lives and never are adopted, while at the same time there are many couples who are postponing childbearing years, whatever, and then they decide they want to have a child and they're going overseas to adopt children when there are many adoptable children right here in the U.S. I was wondering what you thought we could do to put these parents together with the children, and what you thought about the stance of the National Association of Black Social Workers, who are forthright against interracial adoption.
Well, that's a lot of different questions, but I think that it is clear to me that we have got to have a better family support system that can prevent the need for children to have foster care or be placed for adoption in the first place. And the Child Welfare Reform Act that was enacted in 1980, and then the Family Preservation Act that finally was enacted and that is now up for repeal. We're attempting to begin to put into place that system and continuum of care, trying to set in time limits so that there would have to be an evaluation of whether that child could go back home with the family after working with that family or be placed for adoption so they wouldn't be in limbo. But I think that as you know, we have 20 more state child welfare systems in receiverships because of the poor implementation and protection of children in the child welfare system. And here we're talking about cutting it further and dismantling the guaranteed protections. So it makes it very complicated, but I think children need families. Children need attention. A lot of the inability of children to get adopted in our country rests on race, and some on the severity of the disability of many of the children who are in long-term foster care, and some of it just rests on age. People don't like to adopt older children, and so it becomes rather complex. I also think that children should be adopted by loving parents regardless of their race, obviously, to the degree that you can match by race and by religion and by other things, that makes it easier, but that a child needs a caring, loving parent. And I don't care what color they are, that beats foster care and institutions. And so in all deference, I certainly don't take a rigid position against interracial adoption. Quite the contrary, I've seen some very good parents who have to struggle to make sure that their children or culturally comfortable in the way in which they do it. I happen to have wonderful CDF staff who have adopted across race and taken very hard to place children, and I have seen those children flourish. And so I think children need families and permanency, and we should try to ensure that in the best and quickest way we can. Yes?
Hi, my name is...
Two more, she says, and I'll try to be short. I do talk too much.
Good evening. My name is Lori Osno, and I'm working on a thesis, and I'm considering how to bring the models of Sweden where it's illegal to even hit children here. I think we're at a point where, because things have gotten so far out of control, children need to have individual rights, and there needs to be laws that ensure that. And in Connecticut, the National Task Force for Children's Constitutional Rights, headed by Judge Gill, is working to have children into the Constitution by the year 2000 to refute this notion that biology is destiny. And I wondered what you thought of that, or what CDF is doing along those lines, because I don't think, what frustrates me, and this is a quote from Judge Gill, is I think it's 1,000 shards of glass. There's all these little organizations that want to, get together and help, but what are we left with in the end? Really, we have a disaster on our hands, so I wanted to know what you thought of that.
Well, if the question is, I support, our country has finally joined, at least in we haven't signed the Declaration on the Rights of the Child, which is working its way through and may well with, and we're going to be one of the most difficult countries to get to come on, which is trying to set out a worldwide ethic of some basic protections that every child should have. And it's called the Convention on the Rights of the Child, and it has been quite controversial, and the ratification process here will be quite controversial, but at least there is a world ethic that is trying to evolve that says that children are guaranteed certain minimal protections. If the issue is whether or not one favors corporal punishment, I mean, it's rather sad that we still don't protect children the way in which we protect prisoners, at least in the law. We've got, as Americans, to find new ways of relating to each other that are not so violent. We're very, I don't know, the levels of domestic violence and the level of gun violence in our households, and the majority of people who are killed by guns and who are victims of violence, that happens in the household more frequently on the streets, and we have got to find new ways of relating to each other. The excessive advertising of violence and reliance on violence as fun, as entertainment is one, again, we're going to have to come to grips with. We have got to begin to relate to each other in nonviolent ways. I don't know of any other society that would tolerate, or at least in an industrialized world, that would have tolerated 50,000 children being killed by guns, the equivalent of the Vietnam War battle casualties between 1979 and 1991, and somehow where are the protests? We protested on the war. Why are we not protesting when children are killed every hour and a half? And so the whole issue of violence against children, how parents relate to children, how parents relate to each other, how we relate to each other, is one that I hope that we are going to deal with. I was stunned when we got into the violence area to learn that since Dr. King died, we had lost 1.2 million Americans to violent deaths. Over 800,000 of those were guns. And while there is the perception that most violence is crime in the streets, and crime in the streets is serious, half of the gun deaths were suicides, and 95% of those were white. This is not just about other people's children or black kids on the street. And the other half of those 800,000 gun deaths were mostly homicides. Accidental deaths were comparatively few. And about half of those homicides were white. And so we all need to wake up and say that again, violence as a solution to resolving our conflicts has got to be dealt with and faced up with. And I'm very pleased about the growth in conflict resolution and peer mediation, at least more discussion, because most violence occurs in our homes and not on the streets, and we need to come to grips with that. Last question.
Hi. My name is Marilyn Sager, and I'm both a former CDF intern. I worked for Sarah Rosenbaum 5 or 6 years ago, and I've also worked in legal services as an advocate for battered women, and this is perhaps a follow-up to the last question. Those of us who've done that kind of battered women's work know that an enormous number of the women on welfare, and as well as their children, whether they've been directly hit or just witnessed violence, are affected by domestic violence, and we're just starting to get some research on that. I'm wondering if CDF is looking at the connection between welfare reform and what may be a devastating impact on the victims of domestic violence.
Yes, not in a systematic way, but one of the most impressive witnesses we had in the hearings. We've been doing our own rump hearings and with Senator Kennedy, but one of the most impressive witnesses, which was rather stunning, was a woman who is now working for battered women, white mother, who brought her child, who said she would have been dead had welfare not been there, and she talked for years about how for many years she had stayed there because she was really terrified, as many battered women are, about not having a place to take her kid or not being able to support her child. And then one day it was such a horrible episode that she decided to take the risk and left and went to a shelter, but then she talked about the limits of shelter life. You can't stay there very long, and that you got to find a way to support yourself. And it was the most eloquent testimony about why, if there had not been AFDC, she thought she would not be alive, because a few months after that her husband killed himself. And she said, if we were still there, I'm convinced that my child and I would also be dead. And it really brought home the relationship between the lack of safety and the fear of not going and of not being able to make it and to support your child. And so I think much more needs to be done with that, and that is something we are emphasizing, though I'd love to see whatever systematic studies that you may have, because the more evidence of that, other than personal witnesses, it would be very helpful to have. Thank you. Okay.
My question is a two-part question. My name is... I'll make it quick. My name is Ung-Soon Lee. I'm a graduate of Tufts University, and right now I'm working as a medical interpreter at Cambridge Hospital. The question that I would like to ask you is about the issue of the immigrant children who fall between the cracks of the legal system at the moment. And I heard you mention American children many times throughout the lecture, but I was wondering how you were defining that. The second part of my question is, how can interested individuals get involved in this movement?
Good. I'm obviously deeply concerned, and it is profoundly wrong what we're doing in our welfare reform and Medicaid provisions on legal immigrants, and I also am opposed to our punishing children, legal or illegal, whose parents may have come in this country legal, because we're not enforcing other regulations. The issue is not to starve children and not give them health care. We should make sure that we've got better immigration procedures. And so to the degree that, the immigrant provisions in these bills are absolutely appalling. And I think that is something that we are speaking out about a lot more, and that we are trying to do coalitions with, because it is one of many sets of punitive things that I think are unworthy of us. And so I will try to be more mindful in the examples that I use to make sure that I am being inclusive. And in the groups that are coming on Stand for Children Day, there are many who are very strong advocates for the rights of children who come from other countries. And so that I hope we can be more careful about that. On how can you get involved, there are materials outside that describe this day. There are sign-up sheets for anybody who wants to help. There are local organizers here in the state that have been organizing. Kate Fruscher, stand up, Kate, so they can see you, who is a Harvard person who's left and came to work with Stand for Children and helped with AmeriCorps, is the liaison with Massachusetts, and obviously if you sign up out there, you can get all kinds of materials about ways that you can help. But Barry Zuckerman over at Boston City Hospital is going to be the coordinator for the many, many groups that are coming in, and we're just trying to make sure that there's a logistics infrastructure. Because one of the things I've learned is that we talk about vision. You've heard me talk about vision. What people who are coming want to care about is transportation, toilets, food, where they're going to live, how are they going to get there. So that this is a whole different world, but we hopefully have made wonderful progress today in our meetings in setting up that logistical process. But we do hope that you can help get out the word, and they need volunteers desperately to man phones and to get out the word. And so I hope you will sign up out there or talk to Kate, and we will find ways of trying to have you involved.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.